Now, let me introduce our three speakers. First, Claire Cowling. Claire is Associate Research Fellow and an archivist at the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies in the University of London. She began her career as an archivist and records manager in Australia at the Tasmania Archive and Heritage Office and at the National Archives of Australia. In the UK, she's undertaken research projects on legal records in the Commonwealth and records of legal education, as well as working in higher education, the Law Society, the Solicitors Regulatory Authority and Transport for London. In 2018, she became director of the Legal Records at Risk project at the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies in London, and is currently the principal researcher for the Oxfordshire Undeposited Records project, which is funded by UCL Department of Law. The purpose of the project has been to develop a methodology for identifying and targeting undeposited records of potential value in a particularly designated area as a first step for wider surveys and guidance. And the objective has been to provide local historians and organisations and the archive sector with a model that could be used to identify and rescue privately held records. So welcome, Claire. Mark Priddy, many of you will know, is the joint manager in the Oxfordshire History Centre in Cowley with responsibility for the archive collections. Oxfordshire's archive collections, of course, are particularly rich and date from the 12th century through to the present day. The service collects and preserves and makes available county and court, ecclesiastical, estate, business and personal papers in all sorts of forms. Paper, of course, but also photographic, oral history, video archives, newspapers, printed books, maps, ephemera, you name it, the Oxfordshire History Centre has got it, I think, probably is the way to think about it. And thirdly, Jack Latimer. Jack is Creative Director of Community Sites, a hub of award-winning websites and cataloguing software for community archives and local history groups. He's a long-standing committee member of the Community Archives and Heritage Group, which is the national umbrella body that promotes and supports community archives. He set up the Community Archives website and led the team that developed the Community Archives cataloguing guidelines. And earlier this year, he ran a webinar on getting collections online. In a personal capacity, he runs a business called Community Sites, which specializes in websites and cataloguing software for community archives and heritage projects. Since 2006, Community Sites has set up 150 heritage and archive websites in the UK and Ireland. And he became involved with community archives through the My Brighton and Hove Community Heritage website in 2000 that he led and was a volunteer for the first 6 years. And 21 years on, it's still going strong and is now hosted by the British Library. So welcome to Jack and Mark and Claire. Shall we go to the first question that you can perhaps bat backwards and forwards between yourselves? And the first of those is, what should one do when new records are found? What do you actually do when you turn up new records? Who would like to kick off with that one?
Yeah, I'll start. Bill, yes. Mark Priddy, yes. Good afternoon, everybody. When I first saw this question, I was sort of thinking there's about 7 other questions I'd sort of ask immediately. But if I sort of turn that round into a bit of a checklist, because obviously records, as you heard in the introduction, there could be of all different types. So I'll take it generally in terms of, it could be written or pictorial, photographs, pamphlets, audio recordings, and so on. My first thought would be really establish if records are actually archives, i.e. how are they no longer used by the people who created them? Are they still required for some legal or administrative purposes? I mean, that's something we have quite a bit. People sometimes, rather than leaving it too long to deposit material, people deposit things too quickly. So some idea of the use of the documents, the history of the documents themselves would be good. Also, crucially, establishing who might own the records, who might have a say in whether the records can be taken away temporarily, permanently, and what sort of access arrangements there are already, and what sort of access conditions that might there be were the records to be publicised more widely, and so on. Also a good idea to get some sort of idea of the content. You might think, well, that's obvious, but when somebody says, here's a collection of documents, it may just be a few, and then subsequently they bring you a few more boxes, or somebody else nearby or elsewhere has got a subsequent collection. So trying to establish as much about the background to the collection is a good start. Fairly obviously, what sort of condition are documents in? If they've been hidden away in a damp basement or a garage or somewhere for many years, it may be immediate treatment that's needed. So try to make some sort of assessment of whether they can be immediately used, or whether there's health and safety or even damage to the document issues. Also worth trying to establish whether you are actually looking at the original documents, or whether they're just copies or surrogates, and somewhere else their original material, the originals of those documents is in existence. Maybe not necessarily in the early stage, but certainly fairly quickly, you might want to establish whether there's any sort of copyright data protection issues, because as soon as material gets into the public domain, you'll be faced with those questions, and that can be a challenge, increasingly a challenge now as more and more material becomes available, obviously online. Putting in a sort of a very personal plea here, I mean, I would, at an early stage, if you do discover a collection like this, contact the History Centre or an equivalent in another county to get some sort of specialist advice. We can give detailed advice on guidelines on what to look out for in terms of identifying collection, particular documents. We've got particular guidelines, say, for local organisations, businesses, private records, local authority records, and so on. And we can also give you some sort of idea of what's worth keeping and what isn't. I mean, that's a really difficult question, because sometimes you need the wider context to know what is worth keeping. So again, we've provided sort of fairly detailed guidelines for those things. So at least sort of getting some idea of what might be useful to keep for longer term preservation. A couple of other things that we could advise on. Of course, it may be that if the records are found locally, Oxfordshire History Centre is the appropriate place for the material to be transferred to. It may equally be that there's a specialist repository, or the records from part of a collection that are held outside the county, or part of a local community archive. So it may be that we can advise, but we may not be the best place as the ultimate home for those documents. And I think I said just now, access quite important. Depending on whether the records are accessible at the moment and when they're discovered, do give sort of thought to whether these should be more widely accessible, and if so, how can they be made more widely accessible? So even if the decision is made to keep the records locally, making people aware of that through, say, the National Archives Discovery website, so that when people ask us, for example, about the question to the History Centre, we can say we haven't got them, but we know where they are. I think is important. I said just now we can't keep everything, and that's why I think in some cases working with local communities and other repositories to sort of at least ensure that records are kept, and we've got that line of communication is increasingly the way forward for archive repositories like ours. Whether Claire or Jack, you want to add anything to that?
Yes, I mean, you've pretty much summarised a lot, Mark. I think also, I hate the term managing expectations, but I think we have to. Some depositors are under the assumption that we can provide access immediately to researchers. We can't, because we have to list, catalogue, appraise, check on the physical condition. Sometimes we have a huge backlog of material awaiting cataloguing, so we can't necessarily fulfil all the expectations of a potential depositor to make material available immediately. And I found during the Oxfordshire project that this was seen as a bit of a barrier by potential depositors who simply were too impatient, didn't want to wait until the archives that they wanted to send them to could actually find the resources to do this work. So I think patience is very important if you're going to deposit records.
Jack, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I suppose it's a slightly different perspective, because I guess what I talk about, I guess, is my experience of, all around the country you have kind of community archive groups. Sometimes they're existing historical societies, sometimes they're newly formed groups who are setting about considering whether to kind of collect material. I think there is a bit of a distinction between, which I might talk about slightly later, records, and I think something quite specific about records and other material. But by and large, they're out there collecting photos, letters, diaries, oral history material, whatever it is. And I guess for a lot of them, and maybe this kind of helps answer the question, there's kind of branches in the road, when they decide what to do with those collections. And the first is, when they're collecting stuff, is are they ever going to want to keep themselves copies of the physical originals? The vast majority of organisations coming new to this decide they're not going to do that. They don't want to do that. So they're either passing material on to official organisations like Mark's organisation, and getting into partnership with a local archival museum, which is certainly a very, very good thing to do. Or in some cases, what they're doing is they're deciding we're never going to take anything away from the original contributors. We're always going to take a scan and pass it back. My kind of feeling is if they do, I'll talk about around a project which I'll talk about a bit more later, called Letter in the Attic, where we were collecting letters and diaries from Brighton and Hove. And when, in that case, where kind of original contributors didn't want to part with the original letters or diaries, we used to leave a certificate with them. We were working with the Sussex Record Office, and the certificate was just left with the original documents. And it was a message to their descendants, basically, because while those people wanted to hang on to those documents, at one point they'll die, and then some son or daughter may come along who just throws it all out. Yes. So the certificate was left with them saying, if that point comes, please, these are part of the Letter in the Attic collection. The Sussex Record Office would like to have the originals, so please pass them on. So if you do leave things with the originals with contributors, you might consider that. So that's the first branch in the road, I think. Do you keep the physical items? And most people decide, we're just not up to that. That's not our core business, being a repository, and there are better repositories, or there are people who will look after them. Sure. The second thing is, then, are you going to create a digital collection? And some people create the digital collections without even doing cataloguing. They just have folders of stuff on their computers. The risk of that is, where do you put the information about things? People kind of tend to kind of put on the captions in the file names, so you come across these enormously long file names which actually have all the kind of information about the item itself in it. Photo from the 1960s, question mark, taken by so and so and so and so, the file names, and lots of computer software won't handle that after a while, particularly web software. So I'm not sure how, but lots of people do that. And I think there's certainly it's better than nothing. The third thing is moving on to some form of cataloguing or listing of the material. And that's where, if you are going to do it yourselves, then follow some form of kind of guidelines. All the archivists follow a set of international kind of guidelines called ISAG. Slightly unhelpfully, all the museums follow a slightly different set of international guidelines called Dublin Core. And I think what the Community Archive cataloguing guidelines does is try and kind of guide you through to do a core set of fields that are kind of common to both of those, without kind of going into all the complexities that the professional archiving systems have with their records. Okay. So I would urge you to look at that. And then the final thing to say is to consider how you're going to give access to that catalogue, and are you going to put it online, which is another whole question.
Okay, thanks, Jack. That's very useful. As I said at the beginning, we want this to be interactive. So as questions arise in people's minds, do pop them into the chat. One thing that I'd like to ask you, Mark, about a person or a group that hands over their records to, for example, the Oxfordshire History Society, is are they able to attach strings to access, and are those strings negotiated with you, or are they sort of laid down in advance and non-negotiable when a collection is handed over?
It's a good question. I mean, all of us, to some extent, are constrained by what the Data Protection Act tells us in access to sensitive data. But of course, that can be, you can get around that in various ways. You can still make documents accessible, but not publicly accessible all at once, so to speak. So we're slightly wary of people giving us too many stipulations. I mean, if they're reasonable and you know, we find we can still give access to a collection, if not immediately, but some point down the line, that's fine. But if too many collections have their own specific stipulations attached to them, it does become very hard to manage that collection. But yes, we are open to negotiation, and I have to say sometimes it may be the only way we can get a collection in. So we are open to negotiation, but we would hopefully organise all that before, you know, at an early stage before the documents were deposited, and then rather than finding that once the material was here, we were running into issues or slight misunderstanding between the parties as to, you know, what the access was that had been given and when and to whom.
Yeah.
Okay. What I do with my archives is we ask them to sign either a deed of deposit or a deed of gift, and obviously our preference is for gifts because then we've got more control over the collection. But sometimes people just refuse that completely. And demand deposit, and that means they can set, for example, they can set their own access rules. We might have an access rule of 20 years. They might say, oh no, it's got to be 50. So there are different ways of doing it. I've just had one potential depositor refuse to let the collection go because we wanted a deed of gift, and she said it was a violation of her human rights, which was rather interesting. So
yes, I always think in this case of the Malmesbury papers in the Hampshire Record Office, which I think probably as an oversight were deposited on the basis that any use had to be referred back to the current Earl of Malmesbury. So I'm afraid, you know, generations on, the Earl of Malmesbury or the Earls of Malmesbury get these inquiries about, can so-and-so use your family archives? And of course they usually say yes, but it's just a bit of a nonsense if you don't get that right at the very beginning, I guess.
Yes.
I think these questions which are coming up in the chat may well be addressed in question 2, but let me read them nevertheless. Simon asks, what pressures, if any, can be exerted to ensure that locally held documents are kept in suitable environmental conditions, that they're adequately catalogued and publicised, bearing in mind that there are often profound local sensitivities about perceived, quote, outside interference. And I suspect, Claire, that's something that you will have some thoughts about. Lindsay McCormack asks, what provision are community groups making for digital preservation, scans and copies that can corrupt in time? It would be such a shame to lose material that groups have worked hard to collect and have actually collected and stored, obviously. So I think probably, Jack, you might come to that at some point. But does anybody have an immediate sort of response to Simon and Lindsay before we move on to question 2?
Can I just, I'll just quickly answer to Lindsay's question. And we have now got pretty good provision in terms of people offer us born digital or digital surrogate material, taking copies and storing that in the cloud. So if people were worried about material getting lost or not being able to be migrated into something usable and readable at a future date, they could at least give us copies so that they could be sure there was at least an archive copy, so to speak, available. You know, if heaven forbid all the other versions, you know, somewhere along the line were lost, whether that be the hard copy, you know, or a digital format.
But again, Mark, presumably that has to go through the normal kind of accessioning process, does it? That you don't.
Absolutely, yes. And again, the discussion.
Yes. Go on.
Yeah, we have to, yes, exactly. With all deposits, we do try to encourage us to have a discussion in advance, because there are increasing number of issues with any collection that we get given or deposited with us. If we don't sort this out before people come in and sign the paperwork, so to speak, then it causes us trouble in the future, as we've learned the hard way over many years. So yes, all the issues and concerns and the background to a collection coming to us, we would go through thoroughly with a potential depositor in advance.
Okay. Claire, am I right in thinking you're doing question 2?
Well, I think Jack and I just had an offline discussion. I think Jack wants to do a question too. Is that
Okay,
right?
well, Jack, if you're able to also consider
That's fine,
comment about environmental conditions and cataloguing and publicising, that would be really great. So over to you, Jack. The question being, what are the options for recording, preserving, conserving and making accessible local evidence?
Did I get it wrong, Jack?
Yeah, slightly, because I think I've slightly answered that question in my first answer, to be honest, because I went through the decision tree. As I've got a moment to speak, let me just kind of, maybe it's kind of slightly different issue, but it's kind of touching on this question of, you know, what can the formal repositories best do and what can the kind of community organisations best do? And I think it also ties into the question of what you understand by records. I kind of think of records as being something slightly more than just the average collection of, you know, photos, documents, letters, etc. To give you an example, when I kind of I did a project called Letter in the Attic, where we collected these letters and diaries. Most of the material, as you can imagine, was kind of, you know, it was a range of kind of time periods, but it was kind of occasional letters, a diary, postcards, you know, collection of bits of stuff. 99% of it was like that. And then in the course of doing the project, a local society that kind of, you know, would give money advice to kind of people got in touch and said, oh, we've got these records kind of that have been sitting on top of our boiler downstairs for ages. Would you come and have a look at them? And they turned out to be 150 case studies of the Victorian poor, because the forerunner of that organisation was something called the Mendicity Society. Mendicity meant begging in Victorian times. And what the Mendicity Society did is if you were approached in the street, if you were a rich lady and you were approached in the street by a beggar woman, you would go to the Mendicity Society and they would have a team of researchers who would go out and research the beggar woman to find out whether she was a member of the deserving poor or a ne'er-do-well. And they wrote up these case studies in tremendous detail. You know, they were kind of like snoops. They would go and talk to everybody and record where the person lived and their circumstances and their background. And so you have these 150 very detailed kind of profiles of members of the Victorian big poor. And I guess the point about that is that's a data set in its own right. You know, all the kind of individual photos and the letters and the documents you would catalogue according to the kind of cataloguing guidelines, etc. But there you have a kind of data set in its own right, which you might want to search in its own right and transcribe in its own right, and it's clearly valuable. And there's certainly an overwhelming case for putting that in the hands of somebody like Mark, because you certainly don't want to be looking after anything like that yourselves, I'd have thought. But on the other hand, what the community organisations can do is an awful lot of work in terms of, you know, processing that information and doing stuff with that information that the repository may never have time to do. You know, I know, you know, from Christopher's organisation, you know, the Oxford Family History Society, they've done a massive amount of work in terms of kind of documenting wills and recording data sets and making them searchable and making them accessible. And with the best will in the world, lots of the formal repositories may not do that. And I suppose the other thing that the community organisation was doing was we were out there collecting. You know, again, formal repositories with the best will in the world nowadays are under such pressure that how often can they go out and do kind of proactive, you know, free-form collecting policies? So you are, I guess, any organisation that is a kind of not-for-profit organisation with its roots out there in the community has the opportunity not only to do kind of outreach work, but also to kind of do more stuff and make more accessible that material than a repository would do, at the same time as not wanting to kind of keep hold of stuff which is at risk if left with you.
Yes, I think I found that in the Oxfordshire Undeposited Records project, community archives and local history groups are doing an astonishing amount of really good work. Not just collecting stuff, but preserving it, making it available in all sorts of ways. Traditional archives are strapped for cash now. We've got no money. We're not getting any money from central government. We're getting very little from local government. Universities aren't giving us any money, etc., etc. We're going to have to rely much more on the energy, I think, and growing expertise of community archives. I don't know what you think about that, Mark.
You're mute.
You're muted,
You're mute, Mark.
Yes, I agree. And of course, in most cases, a lot of the work that's being done locally will be by people who've got the that local knowledge that the specialist or the county repository won't actually have. So, a lot of that groundwork, it's vital that it's done at a local level. Yeah, I would certainly encourage it.
So it's a kind of a symbiosis between community archives and
Exactly.
and archives, because we can offer expert help and advice and things
Exactly.
like data protection, cataloguing guidelines, things like that. But they've got the local knowledge and the will to do this, to collect and to preserve. But so we can offer advice, and I hope that they would take it in the spirit in which it's offered.
Can I come back to Simon's question, because I think this is quite important, especially when you've identified a group of archives. This issue of environmental conditions and cataloguing and publicity, I think is quite important. And I mean, I've certainly come across an instance recently in my day job where we've been given a body of records, some of which will need some pretty careful conservation. They're sort of Victorian sort of paper, which is crumbling as you open it, really. And from that point of view, I suspect that quite a lot of community archives and individuals probably don't know immediately how they should go about conserving and keeping their records appropriately. What is the thing to do about that? I mean, how does one go about addressing that? And especially if it's going to be handed over, how can you make sure that it is going to go into a repository that's got appropriate environmental and cataloguing positions?
I mean, yes, if I just quickly answer that. I mean, I think my feeling, obviously, again, with a vested interest, is contacting an archive repository at an early stage to discuss the issues. I mean, it may be that somewhere locally there is a suitable building or place that the documents could be stored. But then, of course, once you set up your own local archive to that degree, so you're looking, well, not only as it says there for the public publicity side of things as well, but also setting up repositories, a strong room and access on site. You've got to ensure that that's sustainable beyond the people who are there at the minute. I mean, I've worked in the past with community archives where they've got an extremely good setup, and they've asked us every now and again, we're doing this, is that right? What do you advise about the other? We've got these records, we're not sure whether legally we should hand some of these to you or whether we can keep the others. So I mean, I'm perfectly happy with that. I'd rather people contact us so we can advise them. But as Claire was saying, we can't go out and do as much proactive, cataloguing, collecting, checking on archive collections around the county as we would like. So people setting up their own, groups and arrangements whereby material can be preserved and made accessible, that's absolutely fine. I just, as I say, make that plea for keeping that dialogue with us so that we're at least aware of what's happening.
And we can, of course, immediately offer the names of very good conservators and give advice on the kinds of containers to use, that sort of thing. Straight away we can do that. Whether the local archives has got the money to invest in this is a whole new ballgame. Traditional archives quite often don't have the money to invest in their own conservation now. But we can give that kind of expert advice straight away.
Is there any movement on the issue of crowdsourcing, not quite cataloguing, but crowdsourcing content of archives? I know that John Ryland's library fairly recently had a crowdsourced project in which conversion narratives in the Methodist Archive Research Centre was crowd-sourced in the sense that individual volunteers were able to come forward and agree to transcribe documents, which were then checked by the archive staff and then put online. I mean, that seems to me to be a very imaginative way of getting quite a lot of stuff electronically available fairly quickly and to tolerable standards. They're probably not going to be the sorts of standards that academic historians might want, but nevertheless, they're sort of good enough to provide people with first access. Is that widely, or is that is that a sort of a movement which is on its way, Mark and Claire and Jack?
Certainly, a lot of archives have volunteers doing transcribing. I know that. I'm not so sure about the crowdsourcing aspect. TNA, the National Archives, does it.
Yeah. I mean, I think there are kind of particular, normally very large organisations who are doing, I think, exactly the sort of thing that you're thinking of, the kind of citizen science model, where you have a kind of vast dedicated bit of software and they get people all around the country to chip in to working on a huge data bank of material. I mean, the bread and butter is done purely through the kind of natural functioning of any community archive or local history society. They have their groups of volunteers, they have a body of material, they have little teams of people coming in doing exactly what you're describing, but in a slightly more kind of low-tech way. And the other strand, of course, is the strand of contributory community archives, where you publish your material online and you invite the public to add their own photos, add their own information, add their own commentary, which has been running very successfully. I mean, that's what my Brighton and Hove was huge accumulation of material in that way. It's slightly threatened by social media more recently, because of course what's happened is all the energy that people had in terms of kind of contributing information and sharing information and uploading photos has been channeled into social media, where it's not being archived and not being searchable and being a kind of a temporary conversation. And it's no longer pouring into things like my Brighton and Hove, which were kind of making it searchable and archivable.
Yes. Just in the chat, Paul has sort of replied to Lindsay saying the other point here is whether the group is hosting the digital data or whether an individual is, and if the latter dies or loses interest, does the digital archive disappear with him? And you know, that's clearly a very important point, and one of those, I guess, a problem that none of us quite know where individuals are working, and therefore there is no kind of central map to be able to say these are the people who've got their own digital archive, and therefore when they die or lose interest, that sort of evaporates. As Lindsay replies, it makes backup all the more important, doesn't it, really? And I guess what one would want eventually would be some kind of voluntary register where you could kind of put all your stuff up into a big cloud somewhere, but I'm not quite sure how one organises that.
Again, I think it's quite common that the common situation is you have exactly what you've described. Maybe it's not digital, but you have, the local doctor in the village has for years been the local village historian. He's getting elderly. And very, very frequently we're approached by a new group, and the new group has been formed because they know that doctor is dying. And, the village has kind of, some interested people have got together to kind of work out how to kind of take what he's got and put it online and make it, safeguard it, basically.
One of the things that's a problem, it seems to me, Jack, is that that requires a degree of sort of fleetness of foot, doesn't it, really? Because this may be just my family, but, often what happens is that things are available for a very short period of time, and then, if not thrown away, then certainly they're put into storage and kind of forgotten. That the window for saying, yes, here is a group of papers that we ought to hand over to some sort of body is relatively short. A matter of weeks or a couple of months rather than 18 months or beyond that. Mm. So the being fleet of foot on this, I think, is quite important, and I'm not sure how one persuades people to be. To be quick about this. Mm. Mm.
On the plus side, of the 80 historical history groups I tried to contact, only 2 were no longer contactable.
Really?
So the majority of them are continuing, and some of them go back to the 19th century. So they're not just disappearing when the first person in charge dies, which is really good news, I think.
Yeah, that's good news. He's commented there's guidance for individual archiving, but how does that permeate into public consciousness as an important activity?
I think that's absolutely right. I think there is a lot of community archiving in the sense of groups working on things or established kind of local history societies. What hasn't yet happened is, if you like, kind of citizen archiving, which is what you're talking about, where you're actually kind of directly appealing to individuals to say, have you got private things that you think are intensely important, and at least the equivalent of those certificates, let us know they're there. And in case somebody might, come along at some point, there's very little like that, I think.
Yeah, can I perhaps now ask Claire to talk about, I think, Claire, you're going to talk about question 3. How can a community archive best draw on and contribute to the wider world of Oxfordshire historical research and archives? And I'm hoping, Claire, having read your first stage report on the undeposited records in Oxfordshire, you might give a few examples from that report, because it seemed to me that was an incredibly useful report.
Right. I think really it's join your local groups, join your umbrella history societies. If you haven't already, join the Community Archives and Heritage Group. A lot of community archives in Oxfordshire hadn't heard of the group, and yet that group is there specifically to give them guidance and advice. So that's really important. Talk to the National Archives about getting your community archives known. And if you've got a catalogue, talk to the National Archives about getting that catalogue up on the National Archives Discovery site, so that you become known to the wider world, really, because local authority records are really, sorry, not local authority, I beg your pardon, community records are so important. So important now. In stage 2 of our project, we discovered that there were certain groups that were set up specifically to protect the local area, the local community, from nasty developers and things like that. That's really important. They were collecting records to support that. So there's a wider aspect. We're helping to protect our heritage by doing this sort of work. So the moral of the story is, get out there, join as many groups as possible, and publish as much as possible. And we know community archives and history groups are doing that. They're publishing enormous amounts of articles about their holdings and about the value of their holdings. So that's all really, really important, I think. And participate in seminars like this one.
Claire, can I press you on discovery? Because I think for many of us, discovery is the sort of the point of first contact, really.
Absolutely.
You go to it straight away. But I guess the question is, how do you get on to discovery? Sometimes it seems to me that groups have got very sophisticated catalogue records which just don't fit into the discovery mould, and therefore have to redo their catalogue, which can be very time consuming.
Oh no, don't do that.
No, quite.
I mean, I've just managed to get most of my catalogues up in Discovery.
Okay.
It's not particularly easy, because I'm not terribly computer literate anyway, so I didn't find it very easy. And I'm a professional.
I don't think it is very easy.
But persevere, because as you say, if you're a researcher, that's the first place you go, or it's probably the first place you should go.
Yeah.
Because it just makes your life so much easier. It's the first thing I did when I was doing the Oxfordshire study. The first part of the methodology was to ignore all the records that are already safe, which means records that are already in archives. They're not necessarily safe forever, but they're safe for now.
Yeah.
And so that was to exclude all those records, and that was because I knew how discovery worked as a researcher. That was quite easy. Actually, discovery, if you're a researcher, it is quite easy, I think. If you're an archivist or a community archivist trying to get your material up, it is harder, I agree.
Yes.
But they're very nice, all you have to do is just say, help, I don't know what to do, help, and they'll get straight back to you and give you all sorts of help. So don't be put off community.
Yes, community I would endorse that. Quite a lot of our stuff is now on Discovery, and we found them enormously helpful.
Yeah.
Saying this is how you need to do it, and it was actually, I thought, pretty painless. So I gave them a thumbs up for that, really.
Yes, I think once you get through the horrors of negotiating something with a big government department, then it's fine.
If you want to do it now, because right at the moment they have a huge appetite for trying to get people to upload catalogues. If vast numbers of people start doing that, I suspect their appetite will diminish and they'll be able to give less support. At the moment, they're very, very keen. What it's not, it's not a cataloguing tool. It's a dissemination tool.
Yeah.
So the stumbling block is you already need to have your catalogue. It already needs to match ISAG, standard guidelines, which a lot don't. A lot are kind of based on Dublin Core. and they're often catalogues that have been created by humans, so they're full of kind of little inconsistencies and errors, and one little problem with the reference numbers, another thing will go to pot. So it's it depends what your starting point is. If you've already got a good catalogue, you'll be all right. But if you haven't, there's a lot of work to do.
But if you're not happy with your catalogue the way it is, you can always just put a link up to your catalogue as it is, and they'll publish that as well.
If it's online, yes. If it's online, if it's online,
providing it's online.
Can I turn to Tim Huckvale's question about guidance on good practice for making digital copies, because certainly scans, PDFs, documents, what format is best for preserving digital copies? Certainly, I find with images, is it TIFF? Is it JPEGs? Which of those is better? Where do we go to for guidance on this?
National Archives, for starters.
Yes.
Masses of guidance on that. It's a very difficult one. There's actually no permanent format, digital format. So what you have to accept is that you're going to put it in, say, a TIFF, and 10 years from now, you'll probably have to change it to another format. So when people are digitising, they've got to not think that it's the total solution to everything. It's a reasonably long-term solution. By reasonably, I'd say maybe 10 to 20 years if you're lucky. I imagine PDFs will be around for a good few years.
Yeah, I mean, as a general rule, I would say because there's two things to consider. One is the file format, and the other is the resolution that you scan it to. And by and large, a rule of thumb is that there are some file formats that are called kind of that compress the file in such a way that they lose some detail, and JPEG is one of those. Yeah. And there are some that don't. TIFF was the kind of classic one, but there's now something called a PNG file, which is also pretty good to all extents and purposes. And then the other rule of thumb is that you try and scan it only once. So you try and scan it kind of at the highest resolution that you think you can manage to store. People used to talk about 300 dpi. Lots of people did it 600 dpi now, just file storage gets bigger. But I mean, the good news for any kind of community organisation is, by and large, the technology has moved on to the point where it becomes much more easier to do that than it was. Most scanners are fairly cheap and will do that.
And my sense is that the old idea of unrecoverable documents is sort of on its way out, isn't it, Jack? That the days when you came across a file and couldn't open it, that's probably still the case with desktop computers, but specialists can. I
think it's improving. I remember the kind of in particular, just as Mark was saying about the cloud. The days when you were sort of. And when the CDs came out and everyone said, oh, it's absolutely fine, you can spread jam on them and throw them across the room, that turned out to be completely untrue after a few years. So all those terrible days of kind of keeping things on floppy disks or CDs, or those memories things, fortunately that we've moved on to more flexible file storage at least, and at least gives better scope for kind of batch migration of files into new formats. So I think the picture is improving.
Sorry. I think the moral of the story is don't be scared to do it. I've just set up a digital archive at my archive. Now I don't know anything about digital records, but I've set up a digital archives. Yeah. Now I am assuming that in years to come, the experts will come along and give me some guidance on formats, on storage, on all that, and file conversions, all those things. Yeah. I'm waiting for the experts. As far as I'm concerned, I'm going to save it, and then I'll go to them to ask for help. So I would say don't be frightened. But I would also say if you're going to digitise hard copy records, don't throw away the hard copy.
No.
So just quickly, I'd endorse all of that, and also, I mean, sticking to the most widely used formats. They're talking about the PDFs, the Words, and so on, and JPEGs, TIFFs. I mean, that makes life a lot easier in terms of migrating files, into sustainable formats further on. But certainly in terms of images, you may well want a JPEG copy for ready access and a TIFF copy that's going to be the master version that does get improved from when the next migration is needed, so to speak.
So sort of belt
don't overthink it, really. Yes.
Okay, Tim adds the comment that, of course, we all need to think about hardware as well as software, that clearly we've been talking about software to some degree, but hardware is kind of, interacts with that. So I guess, does anybody have any comment on hardware? Is that something, I mean, it's always scares me witless, but Jack?
Claire? I mean, the main comment I'd make is the absolutely crucial criteria is speed. I mean, it really makes a difference if you're doing a kind of, if your group is doing a scanning digitization project, whether you have a flatbed scanner, which takes 10 seconds to go across the thing, or you have a kind of, an overhead photo scanner that just takes a snapshot and it's done in a second. Practically, it really helps to invest in something that's quick. Most of them, I think, will do things to sufficient quality. When you're getting to scanning fragile originals, scanning really big items, etc., then you're getting into specialist scanning, and then I would immediately go and talk to somebody like Mark.
Okay. Can I come back to Simon's question to Claire about private house archives and whether you've had any engagement with private house archives as opposed to community archives, and if so, what the results were?
When you say private house, do you mean personal archives in somebody's home?
I'm thinking specifically of some of the big country house archives in Oxfordshire and elsewhere, which aren't technically open to the public, but obviously some of them are archives of national importance.
I haven't, because in my initial research, it looked as though most
and some are more accessible than others.
Yes, it looked as though most of them had accessible archives. Not all of them, but most of them. We did try to contact some of them and had no response. There's not much you can do if people won't respond. There's really nothing you can do about.
I didn't know if it was part of the remit or whether it's something for another day and another project.
Where I did have some success was with sports clubs in Henley. Almost no sports club has any archives, or if they do, they're not telling me about them, or if they do, they've got some, and they'll allow the odd researcher in, but they're not making them routinely accessible to the public. And I thought that was absolutely tragic, given that
there is a big sporting heritage project taking place at the moment.
Is there? Yeah. Really?
Yeah.
Oh, good.
www.sportingheritage.org.uk.
Excellent. Oh, I'm glad to hear that, Jack. That's a great relief, because I was very worried.
Just on the issue of country house archives, I think COVID has had a dramatic impact on them, and certainly I was talking to a company which relies really on country or sort of private archivists for conservation work, and this person was telling me essentially that he thought across the country probably 20 or 30 major houses had lost their archivists as a result of COVID, and that he's very worried about it. And I think there is a pretty immediate serious concern about access to country house archives, probably not their existence, but of course if you can't get access because there isn't an archivist, you're probably in the same position as if the Fitzwilliam archives were thrown on the fire by the last Earl Fitzwilliam. Well, that's pretty much the same as not having an archivist and therefore not giving you access to them, really. So I think there's a serious worry about private country house archives.
There is a historic houses archive specialist group which keeps tabs on this sort of thing. So I guess they would be the people to talk to about concerns.
By and large, it's probably fair to say, Claire, that most country house archives are on Discovery, maybe in an outline form. But have you come across many that aren't on Discovery? I mean, Simon, you may have thoughts about that. No,
not many. No. There were only one or two that didn't respond. I mean, they all seem to have archives, and they're reasonably well looked after. Whether they have archivists or not is another matter. Sometimes people just employ an archivist to sort the records out, and then they think that's it. They don't need to do anything else. Of course, that's not true. But at least they're being.
Probably shouldn't talk about specifics, but I don't think Cornbury has an archivist, for instance, does it? And
I don't know. Don't know Cornbury.
I don't think so. No, from my memory.
difficult to find out what, if anything, the sort of problems one can come across. I mean, it's improved. I mean, in my working life, I think a lot of these archives are much more accessible now than they were, and they're being much better looked after. So there has been progress. But there are still, a few black holes dotted across Oxfordshire and beyond.
Yeah. Adrian has asked a question, can anything be done to discourage the sale of documents? Which I think is a very, those of us who scour mags and similar catalogues find to our horror that private papers are being sold. And can anything be done about that? Probably not, I expect. Publicity
again, it's publicity, appeal. You've got to appeal to their sense of civic duty. That's about all you can do, because if they belong to a private person, they can do what they like with them. So all you can do is try and appeal to them. Maybe they're not even aware that archives collect this sort of material. Maybe they're not even aware that they can actually pass this on in lieu of death taxes. Yes. Which is really important. In fact, I think a big estate has just gone to an archives in lieu of death taxes.
Oh, really?
So that's one. If they're greedy.
Yes.
Like, well, you can still make some money.
Yes. Yes, you don't get cash in hand, but you get deduction from your tax. Yes.
Yes. And local authority archives, if they find out in time, and if they have a pot of money, they will go and bid for material that they think is of value. But they've got to A, find out, B, have the money.
Yes. Mark, has Oxfordshire got a pot of money for archives?
No, in a word. I mean, there are ways and means that you can raise money at short notice if that's the only way to keep a collection within the county or indeed the country. But particularly in Oxfordshire, of course, big players like the Bodleian will often jump in anyway. Yeah. So it depends, but it's very difficult for us to do anything much about it, because there are some types of records that they can't be sold, and certainly can't be sold overseas. But generally speaking, as Claire said, if it's their own records they're selling, the best you can do is appeal to people who want to see these in the future, and if they go to wherever, that's it. But that's going to carry very little weight with somebody who's keen to raise the cash.
Yes.
If we William Twining, who is my supervisor on all my projects, is actually here today. If we can find some more money for our project, what we're going to do as part of the next stage is approach all the local history groups in Oxfordshire and say, do you know of records that you think might be in danger? Do you know of records which might be at risk? And we can compile a risk register.
Probably a very good idea.
There's a new group sponsored by the National Archives called the Records at Risk Group. Some of us here are members of, and they're thinking about doing on a wider scale that kind of thing. But of course, that's a huge on a national scale. That's enormous.
Yeah,
an enormous job. But
interesting.
Somebody's got to do it.
Yes, that's a great opportunity to flush things out as well, isn't it? I mean, the proverbial tin of deeds in the attic.
Yes, and then finding out
people haven't thought of putting in it, but because this is all happening.
Yeah. Sorry, sound went then.
Yeah, Simon, I think your broadband is breaking up a little bit.
Oh, is it? Okay, right. No,
sorry.
No
okay. As we're coming to the close, we got sort of another 5 minutes or so. One thing I'd particularly like to ask, perhaps Claire and Mark and Jack, but other people do chip in, is there are instances of very good practice that you could identify? I mean, reading your report, Claire, clearly there were, Henley and Steeple Aston had sort of points of, TIC VG performance. And perhaps I wonder if you, Mark and Jack, would care to kind of give us a little vignette of outstanding performance, which you would say this is a really good example of good practice.
I think the Steeple Aston one is a shining example of extremely good practice, and anybody wanting to set up a community archive and get some advice on how to do it with not an awful lot of money or resources.
Could you just describe what Steeple Aston did?
I'm just trying to find my notes on that.
Okay.
It's a long time since I did. Somebody else speak while I find it.
Okay, Jack, do you want to talk about an example of good practice?
No, I was still having to think, actually, so if Mark wants to go first. Then,
the ones I had very direct contact with were a few years ago, and I'm not sure whether that's still the Wheatleys and the Bensons and so on, and the Witchwoods, but I'm not sure now as to There's probably some better examples or more current examples than those.
Where's Steeple Aston Village Archive is really good. I mean, it's got a very wide, eclectic selection of records, every kind of record you could think of relating to the area. But what it did was develop a comprehensive catalogue using guidance from the National Archives, which it then put up on its website and on Discovery. So it's completely searchable and discoverable. And it's a registered charity as well. So
right.
It's got charitable status. And it's also got a rather nice purpose-built archives as well. Yeah. So it's done everything. It's done everything a community archive could do.
And Paul has put up the link to Steeple Aston archive.org.uk, so people can go and look at that. I mean, that's a great link. Thank you very much, Paul.
But there's also all sorts of other examples of pretty good practice. The Friends of Iffley Village, for example, digitised all their records so that locals could use them, because locals found it difficult to get to the Oxfordshire History Centre. But they've given the original hard copy material to the Oxfordshire History Centre. So it's the best of both worlds.
Yes.
And that's great as well. So accessibility is fine. Locals can look at the digital material anytime they like. Mark's keeping the hard copy safe for posterity. So that's another good way of doing things if you've got the resources to do that.
Yeah.
And I think following on from that, I think having an active website as well is good, isn't it? Because then people can see what you're doing, what you've got, who to contact, and so on. And that makes a huge difference to just logging on somewhere and saying nothing's been done here for 5 years. What does that say about the archive itself and the members of the group?
Yes.
I was trying to think. I mean, basically, part of my perplexity is that a lot of the kind of things that have online catalogues, they're not necessarily following ISAG. As I say, it's completely legitimate for community history groups to kind of, use basic catalogues on Dublin Core. Was I think the focus, of this group of people is ISAG. If you wanted ISAG, then there's an organisation called the Living Archive. They've been running a long time in Milton Keynes. They do all sorts of kind of community-based projects, but they also have an ISAG-based catalogue that's online and is well listed. A very small village called the Turvey History Society has that's turveyhistory.org.uk and livingarchive.org.uk have an ISAG catalogue. If you wanted to look at other villages, then St Margaret's Village in Kent has a very good kind of searchable online archive, but that's based on Dublin Core.
And Lindsay's just shared Bampton Archive.
Yeah.
I'm just going to share also WordPress, our British Methodist Buildings file link, because actually British Methodist Buildings, which is hosted by the Oxford Centre for Methodism and Church History, is quite a neat example, because it uses, it's based on a WordPress, which is a free website, and uses Flickr, which is an image sharing system. And essentially it stores 13,000 images of Methodist buildings across the country, ever so cheaply done by volunteers, scanned in from photographs taken from the 1960s. Cheap as chips, but has had in the last year 500,000 views across the world, which I still can't quite believe, really. So you can do it very cheaply, and you can do it and get big impact by not using anything other than proprietary software. So community archives can use what's available online rather than kind of reinventing the wheel, I think is the message.
Can I just say, I didn't come across one community archive that was doing a poor job.
Yeah,
not one. Yeah. Not one. All
yeah, well, that's heartening.
Yeah.
As we're finishing now, are there any sort of final big messages, Claire, Mark, and Jack, that you'd like to leave us with?
Contact your local archives. Stay in touch. Stay in touch with your local authority archives or your local specialist archives. Don't be frightened. Don't be put off. Don't be suspicious. Don't be suspicious.
They don't bite.
They don't bite. They're there to help.
I think the advent of one message, I think, is that now is a good time. The advent of kind of digitization has actually taken away a lot of the tension that used to exist between kind of formal archives and community organisations, because you're no longer handing over the only accessible copy. If you can go down the route of making digital copies, and then you can do the work on those, and you can make those accessible in your own way, but put the physical originals somewhere else, then everyone wins at that point.
Yes, I mean, I think just going back to the issue of file sharing software, I mean, certainly Flickr, WordPress, and those sorts of things mean that the worry that people like me used to have, which was that this is just sitting on a drive on my computer at home.
Yes,
there necessarily, because if you use a file sharing system, then it's not just on your home computer, it's in the cloud and anybody can access it. And from that point on, you can actually throw away your home computer and still get access to it.
Yes, I think that's true as well.
Mark?
Yeah, well, the other message I would give from the other side, so to speak, is, I mean, we don't think also if you hand these records to us that you never see them again, or they won't become accessible. I mean, most local organisations would deposit materials so they retain the ownership and that level of control. But they would then be available for people to see them. Well, not quite whenever they wanted, but for a wider range of people than maybe if they were just in a local community. But we do, as I said earlier, encourage closer working with ourselves and the communities. We're a one-site service. We can't get everywhere, so the more that can be done in the communities to discover and document and make available records, the better. And we'd be very happy to promote that.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.